Hello. General Hospital today will revealing Sidwell had always been a master of duplicity, carefully walking the razor's edge between loyalty and self-preservation. For years, he had maintained his position within the web of WSB's covert operations by concealing his true allegiances behind a veneer of professionalism and pragmatism. But everything began to spiral out of control the moment word reached Column that Henry Dalton was dead. Dalton, who had been strategically embedded in academia as a research professor, was no ordinary pawn. He held within him the delicate threads of secrets, leverage, and access. His role was to anchor one of WSB's most covert manipulation campaigns. His sudden death was not just an inconvenience, it was a rupture. A fault line had cracked open beneath the surface, and Column, the cold, calculating head of WSB's European division, felt the tremors instantly. To Column, control was everything. Chaos was weakness, and disobedience, even unintended, was insubordination. He had tolerated Dalton's growing unease, even his unauthorized outreach to law enforcement during the Five Poppies incident, because at the time, the damage had seemed containable. But now Dalton was gone, without authorization, without debrief, and more importantly, without explanation. Column viewed this as nothing less than betrayal, a glaring signal that someone within the system had failed, and that failure was intolerable. Regardless of Dalton's shortcomings, he was one of theirs, and his death, especially if it had occurred under secretive or illicit circumstances, represented a failure in operational integrity. The illusion of order had been pierced, and Column's response would be swift and merciless. Sidwell knew this. He had worked under Column long enough to understand that his superior was not a man of empathy or reason, but of consequence. Column didn't ask why, he only calculated who, and what it would cost. Sidwell, cornered by the weight of impending retribution, executed a desperate strategy to deflect blame. He meticulously began to build a case against Laura Collins, the mayor of Port Charles, who had already been entangled in their operations due to her unknowing involvement with Dalton's final days. In Sidwell's mind, she was the perfect scapegoat, visible, respected, and most of all, expendable. He weaponized her public role, manipulating internal reports to suggest she had exceeded her authority, manipulated Dalton for political gain, and obstructed proper protocol. He painted her not as a bystander, but as a calculated manipulator who had taken advantage of Dalton's increasingly fragile position to serve her own private agenda. But Column was not a man easily fooled. He had built his legacy on sniffing out lies buried in bureaucratic polish. The elegance of Sidwell's report, the suspicious precision of the blame it placed on Laura, only heightened Column's suspicions. He had seen this pattern before: the scapegoating, the redirection, the carefully curated villain. He didn't dismiss Sidwell's claims outright, but he didn't accept them either. Instead, he deployed his own quiet probes into the matter. Unmarked agents scoured the logs at Five Poppies. Archived surveillance footage was pulled and enhanced. Deleted server entries were reconstructed, and GPS data was extracted from the municipal vehicles. Piece by piece, the mosaic began to form, and its center was not Laura, but Sidwell. Among the most damning discoveries was the use of Laura's city-issued vehicle to transport Dalton's corpse. Column's analysts confirmed the irregular route and timestamps that placed the vehicle far from its scheduled path. But what drew his attention even more was the fact that Sidwell had been the first to reference the vehicle's location long before any internal investigation had flagged it. How could he have known unless he had orchestrated it? Why was the supposed whistleblower the only one with real-time knowledge of such a precise and damning detail? The implication was clear: Sidwell had been involved in the disposal of Dalton's body, and his elaborate effort to frame Laura was nothing more than a smokescreen designed to obscure his own culpability. Now, Column's silence grew heavier with menace. He did not confront Sidwell directly, not yet. He preferred to let the news tighten slowly. Sidwell's panic, his next moves, would reveal far more than a direct interrogation. And so, while Sidwell doubled down on his campaign against Laura, falsely linking her to unauthorized lab entries, leaking manipulated statements from Sonny Corinthos to support the narrative, and pressuring internal departments to treat her as a security risk, Column began building a private dossier, a ledger of betrayal. Every lie, every omission, every diversion that Sidwell deployed only confirmed what Column already believed. Sidwell was not only responsible for Dalton's death, but he had used that death to further his own power. Meanwhile, Laura began to feel the shifting weight of forces she couldn't fully name. Her movements retract, Her public appearances quietly disrupted, and her allies were growing more distant. The professional world around her was starting to fragment, and she could sense that a narrative was being written without her input. She knew she was being watched by whom. She wasn't sure, but it wasn't just Port Charles politics anymore. There was a darker current now. What she didn't yet realize was that she had become the unintended victim of a high-stakes power struggle a pawn, perhaps, but one now holding enough visibility and proximity to buried truths that her mere survival was becoming an inconvenience. Sidwell, still clinging to his belief that he could stay ahead of the fallout, began orchestrating more aggressive diversions. He floated the idea that Dalton had been working on a rogue project for Laura. He suggested in private communications to Cullum's aides that perhaps Dalton's moral qualms had originated from his personal entanglements with the mayor. Each lie was crafted with surgical precision, but with every message. Sidwell buried himself deeper in the timeline of Dalton's demise. He failed to realize that by continuing to spin the story, he was confirming just how much he knew, and how early he had known it. Cullum's patience was nearing its end. He now understood that Sidwell was not merely incompetent, but insubordinate and possibly treasonous. What had begun as a cover-up for an unauthorized death had evolved into a systemic breach of trust, potentially exposing critical layers of WSB's last active black site operations. And worst of all, Sidwell's attempt to involve a high-profile civilian like Laura had brought far more scrutiny than the situation could afford. Every ripple threatened to become a wave, and every wave threatened to drown them all. And so, as Sidwell continued to act with the illusion of control, Cullum was already preparing his final move, in a locked file within a secure terminal beneath the Brussels office. A termination protocol had been initiated, not for Dalton, who was already dead, but for Sidwell. All that remained was the right timing, the right message, and the final page of a report that would never be read by the public. As for Laura, her survival now depended not on her innocence, but on whether she became useful or expendable in Cullum's next chapter. In a world where no secret stays buried forever, and no lie dies quietly, the storm surrounding Dalton's death was only just beginning. And for Sidwell, it would end not with vindication, but with silence, with a man like Cullum. Betrayal is not something tolerated, it is something marked, tracked, and eventually extinguished. But true to his nature, Cullum did not respond with immediate fury. Instead, he adopted a far more lethal strategy, weaponizing silence and using the truth as a blade that would hover just above the necks of those who had wronged him. He knew that silence could strangle more effectively than confrontation. In his world, letting a traitor stew in his own panic was often more illuminating than any interrogation. And so, rather than storming into Sidwell's office or issuing a public reprimand, Cullum opted for observation. He watched from the shadows as Sidwell struggled to maintain the illusion of control, flailing within the very web of deceit he had spun himself into. It was a silent execution, drawn out over days, each new revelation tightening the grip around Sidwell's future. At the same time, Cullum dispatched his own agents to surveil Laura Collins, not out of certainty in her guilt, but because she, too, had become a liability, a civilian who now possessed knowledge she should never have been exposed to. In Cullum's world, knowledge was currency, and those who held too much without allegiance were ticking bombs. Laura might have been an accidental participant, a collateral presence swept into the undertow of WSB operations. But the simple fact remained, she had become entangled in a conspiracy that was not hers. Her proximity to the corpse of Dalton, her involvement in the transportation of the body, and the obvious political implications of her position as mayor all rendered her a high-value variable that had to be controlled. Cullum did not need to believe the lies Sidwell constructed around her. It was enough that she had touched the shadows. That alone put her on his list of monitored assets, just one misstep away from being eliminated. Laura, for her part, had begun to sense the tightening circle. She had survived enough political storms to understand when her life was no longer being dictated by public opinion, but by unseen forces operating with an entirely different code. She felt the scrutiny, sharpening with each passing day, pressing queries, subtly shifting tone, her staff becoming distant, and her every move suddenly mirrored by unfamiliar eyes. The pressure from Sidwell had already grown intolerable, especially after he had used Dalton's death to manipulate both her and Sonny Corinthos in a high-stakes attempt to gain leverage. But now she faced something more dangerous than Sidwell's transparent coercion. She felt the chill of something colder, more precise. She didn't know Cullum by name yet, but she felt his presence, the unspoken threat of a man who didn't need to be seen to be obeyed. And in that terrifying limbo, Laura realized she had become a piece on a chessboard where both kings were enemies and no side offered sanctuary. Her past choices were being reinterpreted. Her relationships twisted into circumstantial evidence. Her silence could be seen as complicity. Her protest as aggression. One wrong move an unanswered call. A misfiled report. A misplaced word in the narrative Sidwell had so meticulously crafted could become a permanent stain. She understood that justice, in the world she had wandered into, was not a matter of facts, but of expedience. And expedience favored whoever bled first. Meanwhile, Sidwell was growing increasingly desperate. Even if he didn't yet show it, he continued to draft doctored intelligence reports, subtly shifting blame to every possible peripheral target. He suggested in his internal communications that the local police had interfered with their field protocols. He insinuated that Lulu Spencer had deliberately sabotaged Dalton's integration into the Port Charles academic community. He even implied that Rocco Falconeri had leaked classified movements. It was an elaborate fog of war, designed to make his role appear as that of a man trying to put out fires, rather than the one who lit the match. But what Sidwell failed to grasp was that every layer he added to the deception only gave Colum more rope with which to hang him. Colum wasn't merely listening, he was documenting, cross-referencing, reconstructing the last days of Dalton with meticulous attention to detail. He knew, for instance, that Sidwell had access to 5 Poppy security systems and had manually overridden deletion protocols. He knew Sidwell had logged into a restricted WSB network at a time that coincided with Dalton's disappearance. And he knew, above all else, that Sidwell had made no effort to disclose any of this until the story had begun to fall apart. Then came the final insult, the revelation that Sidwell had used Dalton's corpse to blackmail Sonny Corinthos. To Colum, this was not just a miscalculation, it was an abomination. Not only had Sidwell failed to contain the damage of Dalton's death, he had amplified it. He had turned a covert tragedy into a public threat. He had made WSB vulnerable to the most unpredictable of variables human emotion. Mafia retaliation, press leaks, international scandal, all over a petty attempt to preserve his own power in a crumbling local framework. But the real betrayal wasn't the act itself, it was the misuse of Faison's legacy. The project Dalton had been overseeing, the final threads of Caesar Faison's buried research, had been entrusted to a select few. Its protection was sacrosanct, and Sidwell had reduced it to a bargaining chip. Colum didn't even need to hear the rest. That decision alone was enough to sever Sidwell from the organization in every way that mattered. He was no longer a useful asset. He was a contaminant. And Colum, who had built his career out of maintaining control through psychological leverage, now saw only one course of action erase the mistake. Quietly and permanently. Sidwell would not be warned. There would be no debrief, no final meeting, no room for negotiation, just a silent order filed through encrypted channels. An empty office in a forgotten building, and a revised log entry that showed he had never existed. And Laura, if she was smart, would stay quiet, stay still, and hope that whatever piece of her dignity remained unbroken would be enough to keep her off the next list. But the damage had already been done. The chessboard had been overturned. And in Colum's world, once a single crack appeared in the system, it wasn't enough to patch it. The entire foundation had to be rebuilt, cleansed, rewritten. The death of Dalton had started a fire. Sidwell's betrayal had turned it into a blaze. And now, with the flames threatening to consume everything, Colum was preparing the purge. Not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but because, to a man like him, survival demanded nothing less. Laura, in the meantime, had begun to notice strange patterns unfolding around her. Unfamiliar cars were parked near her home for long stretches of time. Anonymous phone calls would ring and fall silent when answered. And an eerie sensation crept over her as if invisible eyes were watching her every move. It wasn't just paranoia, it was an encroaching darkness, slowly tightening around her life. She could feel a shadow descending, oppressive and calculating, but she still couldn't pinpoint who it was that truly sought to destroy her. Was it Sidwell, the man who had clearly set her up in a twisted bid to cover his own crimes? Or was it someone even more dangerous, Colum, a name she had only heard whispered? A man she had never met, and yet who now silently held the power to determine her fate without ever stepping into the light. In a world where truth was perpetually twisted, Laura came to the painful realization that silence was no longer a safe refuge. But every time she tried to speak out, to bring light to what she suspected, she found doors slamming shut, figuratively and literally. Trusted colleagues suddenly avoided eye contact. Allies distanced themselves. Official inquiries were stonewalled. It was as though her voice had been preemptively discredited before she ever opened her mouth. The system around her, once familiar and supportive, had been hollowed out into something hostile and unrecognizable. At the same time, Sidwell clung to the illusion that he could still manipulate the outcome. He believed that by continuing to misdirect Colum by feeding him selective truths and plausible half-lies, he could buy just enough time to erase his own trail. He still thought he was playing a game, moving pieces on a board, but what he didn't realize was that the board had already been overturned. Colum wasn't merely suspicious, he was certain. And for Colum, betrayal was not something to be debated. It was a mathematical equation with only one outcome: punishment. Cold, clinical, and inevitable. Sidwell's survival now existed on borrowed time, measured not in months or even weeks, but in hours and missteps. Each attempt he made to maintain control only brought him closer to the edge. The more he schemed, the more evidence Colum gathered. Each whisper, each covert message, each manipulated file became another nail in the coffin being prepared behind closed doors. He thought he was delaying his fate, but in truth, every move he made was sealing it. And Laura, dragged unwillingly into this ruthless power play, was now at a critical crossroads. Her instincts told her to retreat, to stay silent and weather the storm. But silence had already failed her. She now faced an impossible choice: remain quiet and be consumed by the sins pinned upon her, or take the far more dangerous route of resistance, risking not only her reputation, but her life, her dignity, her truth. And her survival now hinged on whether she could outmaneuver not just Sidwell, but the invisible hand of Colum. In this spiraling vortex of power, secrets, and manipulation, no one remained truly innocent. Everyone was compromised. Everyone was vulnerable. And in the unforgiving eyes of Colum, there were only two types of people: those already punished, and those whose punishment was merely a matter of time.